I learned something strange the day a complete stranger told me to get out of my own fishing spot. Not because he was rude, and believe me, he was rude enough, but because he honestly believed he owned rights to something my family had spent nearly a century protecting. Looking back now, that moment feels almost funny, but at the time it was the beginning of the most stressful year of my life. My name is Ethan Mercer, and my family owns a piece of land outside a small town called Pine Hollow in southern Missouri. We've had it since 1934. My great-grandfather bought the property during the Depression when land was cheap and nobody wanted to deal with swampy creek bottoms. Most people saw mud, mosquitoes, and headaches. He saw potential. He built a small dam across a creek that crossed our land, flooded part of the valley, and created what became known locally as Mercer Lake. Nothing huge, maybe 40 acres of water depending on rainfall, but around here it became a landmark. Families fished there. Kids learned to swim there. I learned to drive a boat there. My father taught me patience there, which is ironic because patience nearly ran out during this whole mess. The southern shoreline belonged entirely to us. We maintained the dam, repaired erosion, cleared fallen trees, and handled every expense that came with owning private water. For decades, nobody questioned it. Then things started changing. About 6 years ago, a developer bought the ridgeline north of the lake. Beautiful views up there. You could see the entire waterline stretching through the valley. Before long, bulldozers arrived, roads appeared, and a new subdivision called Eagle Ridge Estates started taking shape. At first, I didn't care. People build houses. That's life. The developer even stopped by one afternoon. Nice truck. Expensive watch. The kind of smile that feels rehearsed. He introduced himself as Darren Cole and talked nonstop about community growth, rising property values, and bringing prosperity to the area. I remember him standing near our dock, looking across the water. "That's one hell of a lake you've got," he said. I nodded. "Been in the family a long time." He smiled and said, "Makes the whole area more attractive." Looking back, that sentence should have set off alarms in my head. Instead, I just thought he was making conversation. A year later, houses started selling fast. Families moved in. Boats appeared in driveways. Kayaks leaned against garages. I figured some of them belonged to nearby public lakes. Then one Saturday morning, everything changed. I was sitting on the dock with a coffee mug and a fishing rod. It was one of those quiet Ozark mornings where the water looks like glass and the whole world feels half asleep. Then I heard an engine. A pontoon boat was heading straight toward my dock. At first, I assumed someone was lost. Happens occasionally. Instead, the boat pulled right up to my cleats. A man stepped out with his wife and 2 kids. He looked around like he owned the place. Then he pointed at my chair. "Mind moving that?" he asked. "We're unloading here." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. "Unloading what?" I asked. "Our stuff," he said. "We have lake access." I stared at him. "No, you don't." The guy frowned. "Yeah, we do. It's included with our property." His wife chimed in. "We paid a premium for it." I remember feeling confused more than angry. It was like listening to somebody insist they owned your truck because they saw it in a magazine ad. The man pulled out paperwork from a waterproof folder. There it was in bold letters, "Private lake access included." I read the page twice. Then a third time. There were photos of the water, photos of the dock, photos of the boat ramp. My dock, my ramp, my family's property. The man wasn't lying. He had been sold that promise. I helped them turn the boat around and leave, but my stomach felt heavy the entire rest of the day. Something wasn't right. That evening, I carried old file boxes out of storage. My wife, Lauren, found me surrounded by dusty documents at the dining room table around midnight. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Honestly," I said, "I'm not sure yet." She sat beside me while I opened folders that hadn't been touched in years. Survey maps, deeds, construction permits, tax records. The deeper I dug, the worse the situation looked. Around 1 in the morning, I found a promotional brochure for Eagle Ridge Estates. Somebody had left it at a local restaurant months earlier. I nearly dropped it when I opened the pages. There was our lake. There was our dock. There was our shoreline. Large, glossy photographs advertised exclusive waterfront living and guaranteed private lake privileges. My heart sank. A developer had apparently sold dozens of families a dream built on property he didn't own. Lauren looked at me across the table and quietly asked the question neither of us wanted to answer. How many people bought into this? I looked at the subdivision map and counted the lots. Then I counted again because the number seemed impossible. 68 families. 68 households had potentially been promised access to water that belonged entirely to us. And sitting there in the silence of that old farmhouse, surrounded by nearly a century of family records, I realized this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding that disappeared with a simple phone call. It was about to become a war. The next morning, I called a water rights attorney in Springfield named Victor Hayes. I'd heard his name before from a rancher who won a dispute over a reservoir easement, and at that point, I wasn't interested in guesses or opinions from neighbors. I needed somebody who understood exactly where property law ended and water law began. Victor listened for almost 40 minutes without interrupting, then finally said, "Don't do anything yet. Send me every document you've got." Those 2 weeks waiting for his answer felt longer than the previous 2 years. Every day I'd drive past Eagle Ridge Estates and see new families moving in, kids riding bikes, contractors finishing driveways, pontoon boats parked beside garages. People were investing their savings into homes they believed came with something they might never legally touch. Part of me felt angry at the developer. Another part felt bad for the homeowners. Most of them weren't trying to steal anything. They'd simply trusted what they were told. Still, sympathy doesn't transfer ownership. 2 weeks later, Victor called. I still remember standing beside the barn when my phone rang. "You were right," he said. "Actually, you're more right than I expected." I laughed nervously. "That's not exactly comforting." He chuckled. "The dam belongs to your family. The spillway belongs to your family. The lake bed belongs to your family. The shoreline belongs to your family. There's no recorded easement, no transfer of riparian rights, no access agreement, nothing. Legally speaking, the developer sold a view. That's it." For a moment, I just stood there listening to the wind moving through the trees. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by dread. Being right meant the problem was real. Victor drafted a certified letter that afternoon. It went to the HOA board, the developer, and several attorneys connected to the project. The message was simple. Mercer Lake was private property. The dock was private property. The boat ramp was private property. Any unauthorized use would be considered trespassing moving forward. Then came the part everyone remembers. I locked the boat ramp. The ramp sat on our southern shore and happened to be the only improved launch point on the entire lake. My grandfather built it with a tractor and concrete forms back in the 1950s. By Saturday morning, a heavy chain stretched across the entrance and new signs stood on both sides. Private property. No unauthorized access. Trespassers subject to prosecution. By noon, people were showing up. Some were confused. Some were angry. One man demanded to know who gave me authority to close the ramp. I pointed at the deed. Another woman waved a sales brochure in my face. "We paid extra for lake access," she yelled. "Then somebody sold you something that wasn't theirs to sell," I replied. That answer didn't make me popular. Within days, neighborhood Facebook groups exploded. Screenshots got shared everywhere. My name started appearing in community discussions. Depending on who was posting, I was either protecting family property or ruining 68 homeowners' investments. Then came the first meeting with the HOA board. They invited me to speak at a special session held in the subdivision clubhouse. I walked into a room packed with angry residents. Some looked frustrated. Others looked betrayed. A few looked ready to throw me out a window. The board president, a retired banker named Carl Benton, tried to keep order. "Let's hear Mr. Mercer out." The room quieted. I laid copies of the documents across a table. Survey maps, deeds, permits, ownership records, nearly 90 years of paperwork. One homeowner stood up. "So you're saying we were lied to?" Before I could answer, another resident snapped. "No, he's saying he's changing the rules." That started an argument that lasted nearly 20 minutes. Finally, I said something that seemed to stop everyone. "Look, if somebody sold you my truck without asking me, would you expect me to hand over the keys just because you paid for it?" The room went silent. Nobody liked the comparison, but nobody could really argue with it either. Carl rubbed his forehead and quietly asked, "Did the developer know?" I remember looking directly at him. "I think that's the real question." The answer arrived sooner than expected. During discovery conversations between attorneys, several emails surfaced. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just enough to paint a picture. Years earlier, Darren Cole had been informed by a surveyor that ownership of the lake remained entirely with my family. The warning existed in writing. He knew. He built the subdivision anyway. He marketed waterfront privileges anyway. And he sold dozens of homes anyway. That's when public opinion started shifting. Unfortunately, before it shifted completely, things got ugly. One afternoon, I came out of Walmart and found all 4 tires on my truck slashed. No witnesses. No cameras facing the right direction. A week later, Lauren answered an anonymous phone call. The voice said, "Your family should have left things alone." Then the line went dead. Our teenage son stopped getting invited to neighborhood fishing trips. Our daughter came home upset after hearing parents complain about us during a school event. Those moments bothered me more than the legal threats. Adults can handle conflict. Watching your kids absorb consequences they didn't create is something else entirely. More than once Lauren asked if there was a compromise. More than once I wondered the same thing. But every compromise seemed to begin with one assumption: that we should surrender ownership because someone else had profited from ignoring it. I couldn't do that. My grandfather spent decades maintaining that lake. My father spent decades maintaining that lake. Walking away would have felt like betraying both of them. Then the lawsuit arrived. The HOA sued. Their attorney argued implied access rights. He argued homeowners reasonably relied on marketing materials. He argued decades of anticipated use had created expectations. Victor wasn't impressed. "Expectations aren't deeds," he said. "Let's go to court." The hearing wasn't nearly as dramatic as television makes these things look. Mostly it was paperwork, legal arguments, and long stretches of waiting. But there was one moment I'll never forget. The HOA attorney held up a glossy brochure and said, "These representations were made repeatedly to buyers." The judge took the brochure, looked at it for several seconds, then set it down. "Counselor," he said, "a brochure is not a deed." The courtroom got very quiet. The attorney tried another argument involving access expectations. The judge interrupted him again. "A photograph is not an easement." Victor leaned back in his chair. I knew right then where things were headed. Less than an hour later, the case was dismissed. Just like that. Years of assumptions collapsed in a single afternoon. Before ending the hearing, the judge added one final observation that changed everything. He looked toward the homeowners and said, "If you believe you purchased rights that were never conveyed, your dispute may be with the party who sold those representations. That's legal language for you should probably sue the developer." And that's exactly what happened. Within weeks, residents organized meetings without the HOA board. Attorneys started reviewing purchase agreements. Homeowners who had spent months blaming me suddenly began asking much harder questions about Darren Cole and his company. The anger didn't disappear. It simply found a new destination. 6 months later, rumors started circulating that multiple claims had been filed against the developer. Settlement discussions were happening behind closed doors. Sales in the subdivision slowed. Lawsuits have a way of doing that. Then one snowy January morning, I received a phone call from Carl Benton. His voice sounded very different than the first time we'd met. Less defensive, more tired. "Ethan," he said, "I think it's time we talked." I had a feeling that conversation was about to change everything. A week later, Carl showed up at my farmhouse with 2 board members and a stack of folders tucked under his arm. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from that first HOA meeting. Back then, people looked at me like I was the villain standing between them and the lake. Now they looked like exhausted people trying to clean up a mess somebody else had created. We sat around the same dining room table where Lauren and I had first discovered the brochures months earlier. For a few minutes, nobody talked. Then Carl finally sighed and said, "We should have asked questions sooner." I appreciated the honesty. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first truly honest thing I'd heard from anyone connected to the subdivision. He explained that most homeowners no longer wanted another legal fight. They wanted certainty. They wanted access to the water they'd fallen in love with when they bought their homes. Most importantly, they wanted a solution that wouldn't drag on for years. Then he slid a proposal across the table. The HOA wanted a lease access. Not ownership. Not rights. Access. I remember looking down at the document and feeling something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Not because I was winning, but because for the first time, everyone seemed willing to deal with reality instead of pretending reality didn't exist. Negotiations took several weeks. Victor handled most of the legal language while I focused on practical concerns. If families were going to use the lake, I wanted clear rules. My family would retain ownership of the dam, the spillway, the lake bed, and all maintenance authority. We would keep the right to temporarily close access during drought conditions, major repairs, or safety concerns. The HOA would pay an annual fee per household, adjusted over time for inflation. Liability protections would be included. Environmental restrictions would remain in place. At one point, a board member jokingly asked if I was becoming the lake's landlord. I laughed and said, "No, I'm just making sure my great-grandfather doesn't spin in his grave." Surprisingly, that broke the tension in the room. A month later, the agreement was signed. 20 years. 68 households. Everyone walked away with something. The homeowners finally got legal access. My family retained ownership and control. The lake stayed protected. Looking back, that's probably the outcome that should have happened from the beginning if honesty had been involved. These days, life is mostly quiet again. Every summer, I sit on the same dock where this whole story started. Kids from Eagle Ridge paddle kayaks across the water. Families fish along the shoreline. Pontoon boats cruise slowly through the coves. Sometimes people wave. Sometimes they stop to chat. Most of the homeowners who arrived after the lawsuits only know pieces of the story. To them, it's just a lake. To me, it's a reminder. Every board, every post, every section of shoreline carries memories of people who are no longer here. My father repairing storm damage after a flood. My grandfather checking the spillway after heavy rain. My great-grandfather standing in muddy boots nearly a century ago, imagining a lake where everyone else saw a creek. That's the part brochures never capture. Property isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about stewardship. Sometimes it's about responsibility. Sometimes it's about refusing to let history get erased because somebody found a way to profit from it. Every January, the HOA sends a check under the terms of the lease agreement. The first time that payment arrived, Lauren looked at me and smiled. "Well," she said, "I guess they're finally paying for lake access." I laughed harder than I probably should have. After everything we'd been through, it felt like the perfect ending. Or maybe not quite the ending. Because here's the part people still argue about whenever this story comes up. Some folks say I should have opened the lake from the start and avoided all the conflict. Others say I should have charged even more after what happened. A few still believe the homeowners deserved permanent access because they bought their homes in good faith. And honestly, I understand every one of those viewpoints, even if I don't agree with all of them. What I know is this: my family didn't take anything away from anyone. We simply refused to give away something that already belonged to us. The developer sold a dream attached to water he never owned. The homeowners paid for promises that were never his to make. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a simple truth got buried beneath marketing brochures and expensive sales pitches. Ownership still matters. Facts still matter. And no matter how pretty the advertisement looks, a photograph doesn't magically become a property right. Even now, when the sun sets over the water and the entire lake turns gold, I sometimes think about Darren Cole standing on that shoreline years ago telling me how much the lake improved the value of the area. Turns out he was right about one thing. The lake was valuable, just not valuable enough for me to give it away. So what do you think? If you had been in my position, would you have opened the lake and let everyone use it? Or would you have defended your family's property the same way I did? And if you were one of those homeowners who bought a house believing the promise was real, who would you blame the most? The developer, the HOA, or the property owner who enforced his rights? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoy real property disputes, HOA drama, and stories where the truth ends up being more complicated than it first appears, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your perspective below. I'd genuinely love to hear where you stand on this one.